Hi, I'm Reece Coleman, Waterways and Wetlands Research Manager in the Applied Research team in Melbourne Water, and welcome to another edition of Melbourne Streams, where we're talking all things waterways research. And we hope you've been enjoying the series over the past few days, and there'll be many more presentations to come over the next couple of weeks. Today, I'm pleased to bring you a talk from Dr Sacha Jellinek from the Melbourne Waterway Research to Practice Partnership with the University of Melbourne. Sacha is also quite interesting in that he has a hybrid role where he's working half the time at the University of Melbourne and half the time in Belinda Lovell's team, the Waterways and Biodiversity team in integrated planning. Sacha is an ecologist with an interest in habitat restoration at the landscape scale and prioritising management actions for biodiversity under a changing climate. Prior to working at the University of Melbourne and Melbourne Water, Sacha has worked for Greening Australia and La Trobe University and the Arthur Rylah Institute, part of DELP. Sacha's talk is titled, "What Drives Revegetation Outcomes and How Can Monitoring Assist Us to Effectively Restore Habitats?" In his talk, Sacha will talk about ecological restoration principles and how they apply to revegetation along waterways. And he uses 3 case studies to demonstrate why monitoring can be really useful to help us think about not only what outcomes did we get for our revegetation, but also what are the potential things that are driving a successful outcome or not. This talk aligns really nicely with our Healthy Waterways Strategy 2018 and our conceptual models about what's important for vegetation and vegetation management. And in his new role, Sacha will be reviewing those conceptual models. Sacha will also be looking at our own revegetation data that we've been collecting over the past 10 years at some key sites, and also collecting new data to help us think about the kind of things that we should be incorporating into our revegetation programs to increase the success. If you have any technical questions about the talk, then feel free to contact Sacha directly. He's provided his contact details. But if you have questions more broadly about the Waterways and Wetlands Research Program, then contact myself or Slobodanka Stojkovic, who's also in the Waterways and Wetlands Research team, and we'll try and help you out with those questions. Of course, you can also go onto the intranet and look at our new research hub. So if you just search Research Hub on the intranet, you'll find it. And it's an opportunity to explore all the research that we've been doing in the Waterways and Wetlands Research Program and other research portfolios shortly. You can get access to reports, papers, presentations, that sort of thing. So have a look there. We hope you enjoy this presentation and we look forward to providing more in the days to come. Thank you.
Hi. My name's Sacha Jellinek, and I'm here to talk to you today about revegetation outcomes and how we can use monitoring to get better revegetation outcomes for our restoration projects. I'm a research fellow at the Waterways Ecosystem Research Group, and I'm also based at Melbourne Water. So today I'm going to talk about revegetation and what it is, and also what habitat restoration is, and why it's really important to monitor these habitats that we're trying to restore. I'm going to talk about assessing restoration outcomes, and I'm going to use the Society for Ecological Restoration guidelines as an example of how to monitor restored areas and how to test if you're getting good ecological outcomes. I'm also going to use 3 case studies, 2 of which are from the Coorong Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth in South Australia, and 1 is a community-based revegetation project based in Victoria. Then I'm going to talk what we can do at Melbourne Water and how we can monitor our revegetation and hopefully get good revegetation outcomes. And then I'm going to summarise. So restoration is a continuum. It's a way to improve the environmental conditions and reverse ecosystem degradation and landscape fragmentation. And as you can see from this figure, if we go left to right, both ecological health, biodiversity and ecosystem services increase over time if we're undertaking remediation, rehabilitation and ecological restoration. And when we're talking about ecological restoration, this can occur in all of urban, suburban, agricultural and industrial landscapes. So when we're talking about ecological restoration, we're actually saying that it's the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged or destroyed. And we can undertake revegetation in this to establish plants on the sites, and that can be terrestrial sites, freshwater or even marine areas. And the Society for Ecological Restoration has 8 principles underpinning ecological restoration, and these are good engagement of stakeholders and drawing on all types of different knowledge, having a reference ecosystem that you're trying to restore to, so having a remnant patch that is the same vegetation type as what you're trying to restore, having an ecosystem that supports the recovery of these systems. And number 5 is really important. It's having really clear goals and objectives about what you're trying to restore and how you're going to measure it. And basically, we're aiming to get the highest level of recovery that we can in any given system. And overall, we want these systems to be part of the larger landscape and to connect through from small patches to larger remnant areas. So monitoring allows us to get a better idea of how effective our revegetation is and the long-term outcomes of them. So how a plant's surviving, growing and reproducing, and also how our revegetation varies between seasons, years and across species, provenances and locations. And we also want to know what environmental factors are likely to influence revegetation effectiveness. So that could be temperature, it could be rainfall, it could be soil type, it could be a variety of different things. And this information can also be gained by looking at how animals are using these revegetated areas. And overall monitoring can help us make revegetation more cost effective. And hopefully over time we can adaptively manage what we're doing to get better restoration outcomes. And there's a number of different factors, as I said, that influence planting outcomes. And that's planting shock, so how well the plants do directly after being planted, the extreme temperatures and rainfall that we might expect under a changing climate, age and condition of nursery stock, if the plants are guarded, and how they were planted in the first place, the soil moisture while they're being planted and after planting, weed competition and grazing, if there's any damage to the plants over time, such as from wind, if you're planting the soils into non-wetting soils like sandy areas, and these areas may not allow the plants to get enough water to the root system. And also we want to know what the previous land use practices on the site may be and if they're likely to influence the revegetation outcomes. So the Society for Ecological Restoration has 6 different categories which tests how effective the restoration is being. So it wants to know if there's any threats to the site, such as invasive species, and if they're absent, what the environmental conditions are, so what the soil type is, if there's enough water, if the topography is correct for the plants you're trying to plant, if the species you're trying to plant are native and they're a part of the local ecosystem, if you're actually getting structural diversity, so you're planting all the key structural attributes that are normally found in that vegetation community. So if you're planting in a woodland community, for example, understory, midstory and an overstory. If you're getting enough ecosystem functions out of the areas that you're planting. So are there species interactions going on? Is there competition? are you actually getting the ecosystem services that you would expect from this type of habitat? And also, are the ecosystems being appropriately integrated into the larger landscape or aquatic context? So this is an example of their rating system, and they give it a 1 to 5 star depending on the project. So this example, at the start of the project, baseline, this project was getting around 3 stars. It seemed to have okay species composition, the physical conditions were okay, and also there was generally an absence of threats. But over time, after a 10-year period, you can see that these absence of threats, physical conditions, species composition and structural diversity really increased greatly. And overall, after a 10-year period, it's gone through from a 3-star to a 4-star project. So really being able to track if the areas that you're trying to restore are being effective. So the first case study I'm going to talk about is in the Coorong Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth, and it's a terrestrial revegetation project. So the Coorong and Lower Lakes was well funded after the Millennium Drought, and it was funded for 5 years by the state and federal government. It was a large project, so 142,000 hectares, and it was ecological significant. So a lot of the lakes were Ramsar wetlands, and it provided massive amounts of habitat for threatened flora and fauna, and it had also very strong indigenous values. It was planted with both terrestrial and wetland species, and the first example I'm going to give is about those terrestrial plantings. So we planted over 1,300 hectares with tube stock generally, and this was undertaken by both contractors and the general public. Over 5 million plants were planted with 200 different species planted. And each site we surveyed twice, first time in spring directly after planting, and the second time after the first summer in autumn. And we looked at sites from 2012 to 2015, and overall we sampled 160 sites using 50 by 2 metre transects, so multiples of these at each site. And we'd go along, we'd identify all the species in the plot directly after planting and count them, and we'd do the same after the first summer. So we found that survival was relatively high directly after planting, so about 90 to 96% of the plants planted survived. And 3 months post-planting, that was 3 months post-planting, but we found a decline of about 60 and 69% of the plants survived after the first summer. And we found that trees and shrubs and vines generally survived pretty well, but grasses didn't survive so well after the first summer. And we also found that certain species, such as pink gum and ridgefruit mallee, 2 salt species, and coastal flax lily and tussock grasses generally survived really well in these plantings. And this is a graph of the most commonly planted species in the study. So what environmental factors did we find influence these plants? Well, we found that high maximum temperatures, so if you had extreme hot days, that really lowered the survival of the plantings. Also, we've got better survival in higher rainfall areas and where the plants were planted, so on what soil type. And we generally had lower survival on sandy soils and higher survival on loam soils. So in summary, survival varied between sites, years and life forms and different species. We found that soil type, maximum mean temperatures and rainfall really influence the survival of plants. And looking forward, we could see that climate change may really influence our revegetation outcomes in this system. So we may need to think and adapt where we plant, when we plant, and how we plant. So when I say when we plant, I mean, do we start later in the year or earlier in the year to make sure that plants have enough rainfall and have enough moisture down in the roots to make them survive over the summer period. The second case study I'm going to talk about is wetland restoration. So rather than planting multiple species in the wetland, we just planted one species, and it was called the river clubrush, or Schonoplectus. And it was planted throughout Lakes Alexandrina and Lakes Albert, which is the end of the Murray. It's a large sedge or bulrush, which grows to 2 to 3 metres high, and it's usually found in fairly deep water up to 1.5 metres. It declined due to livestock grazing and drought, and it was replanted to try and hopefully reduce erosion on the shoreline, but also increase the native plant diversity between the planting and the shoreline. So plants were planted from November through to March throughout the lakes, and they were planted in 2 offset lines at 1 metre intervals. They were usually planted in about a half a metre of water and 10 metres away from the shoreline or further. And some of these plantings extended for up to 1 kilometre along the shoreline. So we wanted to see how young plantings and old plantings grew, and also if there was much plant diversity behind those plantings in comparison to control sites, so areas which hadn't been revegetated, or remnant areas, so areas which were 20 years or more older. And we wanted to know, as I said, how well they grew, so their height and their width. And we used 5 transects along a 100-metre section of shoreline to do this. And that's square boxes around the stars. And we also wanted to know what the community composition, so what other plant species were being identified behind those plantings. So we did this at different depths, 5 different depths. So basically at the shoreline out to almost 1 metre in depth. And we're identifying all the plants we found in those different sections and also their abundance. So the plants, we found that our planting became substantially wider and higher as planting age increased. And also as time increased, the species richness and abundance of these different species that we're surveying increased, with older plantings really starting to resemble the remnant habitats that we were trying to restore. Community composition was really important in these areas, and we could see that over time, the communities really started to look more similar to remnant areas in the older plantings, and the younger plantings and the control sites also seemed fairly similar. So we could really say that over time, our plantings were benefiting the local environment and that they were increasing species diversity. And anecdotally, we could also say that fish, macroinvertebrates and birds were really benefiting from these plantings. And we could also see that the shoreline wave action was reduced, meaning that sediment loads started to drop and there was lower erosion on the shoreline. And we could see that after 10 years, these plantings may really start to resemble the remnant habitats that we hoped they would. And there was also other social benefits. So landholders could see better stability of their shorelines. It looked nicer around the local towns, around the lower lakes, and the water quality was also likely to increase over time. The third case study I'm going to talk about was based in Victoria, and that's community-based revegetation monitoring. So this is a project that was undertaken by La Trobe Uni and Arthur Isler Institute, along with a lot of other stakeholders, which I'll talk about shortly. So the aims was to develop a quick and robust monitoring technique for community groups to use to assess how effective their revegetation projects were. We wanted to assess the outcomes of revegetation in terms of the survival of the plants planted, and also, well, looking at not only trees and shrubs, but also the understory. We also wanted to determine the factors that affected the variation in survival among different species and different regions. So looking at the environmental factors which might have influenced how well the plantings did. So it was undertaken in 8 CMAs, and we had roughly about 60 sites or 120 plots that were surveyed across these sites. And this was undertaken by land care groups, catchment management authority staff, non-government organisations such as Bush Heritage and Green Australia, and also by water providers. So we went and marked out 2 or more plots at each site, and these were 50 by 4 metres in size within the planting area. And the participants usually recorded all the plants in those plots at the time of planting, so what the species were and the number of each species in the plot. And they went back after the first summer and repeated that to see what species were in the plots and also the number of them. So we could really tell at planting and after the first summer how many plants survived and grew. And we also recorded things such as land use history, what the landscape being planted was, what the site preparation and planting techniques were, and what the animal and pest management was at the site. So we really had some background about the site and what might be influencing the revegetation outcomes. So survival after the first summer was about 59%. But this differed greatly between the different CMAs. So we got fairly good survival in the Port Phillip and Western Port area, for example, and not such good survival in the Corangamite area. And we also found that certain species such as swamp paperbark, hop goodenia, blackwood and wattle, silver wattle survived really well, along with manna gum, swamp gum, whereas other species didn't survive so well, and these were species such as tea tree and Bosseria and Allocasuarina, so she oak. Overall, rainfall had a big effect on our planting, so sites that were wetter had better survival, and we also, as the earlier study I talked about showed, extreme high temperature played a big role in plant survival. We also found that if the plants were guarded, that increased their survival over time. So we could really say that monitoring by community groups is a really effective way to see how well our revegetation outcomes are. We showed that the results were most effectively the result showed that we could effectively undertake monitoring in revegetation areas, and that we could see that extreme weather events, rainfall, and if guarding was undertaken, also influenced the planting. But overall, we need more data to test exactly what happens in different CMAs and how effective these management actions are. And we could also see that a database was really required by these community groups to store data, and also ideally an associated app. So when they're out in the field, they could actually record data directly into the database, not worry about losing sheets of paper when they got back into the office. So what information do we need to collect to assist in our monitoring? Well, we need to know for tube stock planting, for example, what species were planted and how many of each species were planted at a given site. For direct seeding, we need to know what the seed mix is, and ideally how many kilograms of each species is used per hectare at a site. We also need really accurate mapping of the planting area. So the area actually planted, not the area that is part of the overall planting area. We also want to know how the plants were treated and if fertiliser or water crystals were used. It's really good to have an idea about what site preparation was done and when weed control or pest control was undertaken, and if the site was fenced, if the plants were guarded or not, and what guards were used, and what nursery the plants came from, and what condition the plants were in when they were planted. And if we're looking at climate adjusted plantings, and I'm doing another talk on this in another presentation, what are the different provenances that we're planting in a given site? We also know what the age and health of the plants were prior to planting, and the site topography, soil type, and land use history has been at the area that we're undertaking revegetation. So what are the different management actions that we can undertake if we know that different factors influence plant survival? Well, for climate, such as lower rainfall or extreme temperatures, we may need to alter the timing that we undertake revegetation in, and consider using different species or provenances, or even watering in the plants. We also need to consider if we're going to guard our plants, and also do a trial to see which guards are most effective in a given area. We also need to know what the soil type and planting of our region is. And we really need to make sure that the plant species we're using are best adapted for that type, depending on its hydrology, soil type, topography, aspect, etc. And it's not just climate or environmental extremes that are likely to influence our plant survival. There's a whole load of different factors that influence it. So we really need to undertake monitoring and adaptively manage our plantings over time to get the best results. So in summary, we really need scientifically robust monitoring to get the best out of our plantings. We need to consider tracking the revegetation outcomes using something like the Society for Ecological Restoration guidelines. We want to make sure that we plant the right variety of species in a given site. So trees, shrub, grasses and herbs, if that's appropriate for the EVC that we're wanting to restore. It's not all about plant survival and growth. We also want to make sure the structure and function of the habitat is correct compared to reference communities. We want to know what animals are using the site, and we want to know if there's social values that the sites have for people, so aesthetic values, for example, and also the ecosystem services these sites could have for farming communities or local urban communities. So thank you very much. And if you've got any questions, please shoot me an email. Thank you.